I'm back. I'm back from my 30-day meditation retreat, and man, it's good to be back. But I won't be talking about much of that here today. Today we're going to be talking about what is consciousness, kind of a standard topic that we talk about. But if you're interested about insights and mistakes that I made and lessons learned from my retreat, then I'll be posting 3 videos that I shot during the retreat on my blog, so go check those out. Of course, I'm sporting a new little look for you. I got a fancy shirt, got a fancy beard. How do you like that? You can post a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the shirt and the beard down in the comments section, and we'll see. I don't know if I'm keeping them or not, but we're just doing something new. But anyways, let's get right into our main topic. What is consciousness? Because this is such a deep, deep, juicy topic. This is one of the most important questions that you can ask and answer in your life. In fact, about 5 years ago, I made a list. I made a list of my top 100 most important questions in life that I wanted to answer. The most fascinating questions that I had. And at the very top of that list, question number 1 was, what was consciousness? And so I followed up on that. I didn't just make the list. I followed up on that list. I started buying books. I started reading into non-duality. I started doing practices, meditation and yoga and this and that, and psychedelics. And that was a long journey, which ultimately led me to where I am today. And today I understand what is consciousness. And so can you. And in fact, most people don't know this, but mankind has understood what consciousness is for over 5,000 years. Well, at least certain small portions of mankind, and the rest of mankind hasn't been able to get it. So here we're attempting to fix that problem. We're going to try to explain consciousness. And see, the situation you find yourself in is that you find yourself conscious. That's how you know you exist. But you're not conscious of what consciousness is. That's a very interesting predicament to find yourself in. And then you might think like, well, let's appeal to neuroscience to answer this question. And maybe if you're on YouTube and you're searching for this topic, what is consciousness? What you'll probably get is you'll get a bunch of people talking about neuroscience and the latest discoveries there. And maybe there's this philosophy or that philosophy about consciousness. And the problem with all of that is that neuroscience fundamentally cannot answer the question of consciousness, because neuroscience is occurring within consciousness. So actually neuroscience is incapable of grasping what consciousness is. And we'll explain a little bit more about why that is as we keep going. The problem, I guess we could say, is that neuroscience assumes that consciousness is an epiphenomenon and that it's not fundamental to reality itself. It's not fundamental to, let's say, physics or the metaphysics of reality, and this turns out to be false. Consciousness is fundamental and it is irreducible. It's more fundamental than atoms, energy, time, space, the universe itself, or brains, or even life. It comes prior to all that. In fact, all of those things are occurring within consciousness. But this is very counterintuitive if you're trying to understand and you're coming at this from the materialist paradigm. Now, I'll be talking about the materialist paradigm a lot here because it's the primary obstacle to understanding what consciousness is. And the materialist paradigm is simply the idea that reality is just basically a bunch of bouncing balls like atoms, particles, or energy, and it's dumb, brute matter, and that's all there is to it. And then consciousness is just some sort of emergent property, some second order, third order, fourth order thing that comes about from these atoms, which we really don't know how, but we assume we'll figure it out if we just keep studying neuroscience more. That's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is because when you become conscious of what consciousness is, which you can do, we're not speculating here. This is not theory that I'm giving you. I'm saying that you can actually become conscious of what consciousness is. And if you do, then you'll realize why neuroscience and materialistic science cannot grapple with consciousness, and it never will be able to. Of course, if you did know what consciousness was, you would be a mystic, and you would be enlightened. People don't appreciate that. See? You would stop being a neuroscientist. You would stop being a scientist. You would become a mystic. And you would be labeled as such, and you would be put into that category. So one thing I wanted to warn you about is that when you hear neuroscientists or philosophers like maybe Daniel Dennett or Sam Harris, people of this ilk, talking about consciousness, they actually don't know what they're talking about. Be very suspicious of what they're talking about, because the only way you can really understand consciousness is if you have some very deep awakening experiences, which these people have not had. There's a great misunderstanding about what consciousness is. So let's first say what consciousness is absolutely not. Consciousness is not brain activity. Consciousness is not reason or knowledge or intellect. Consciousness is not emergent phenomena. Consciousness is not something that is biological or that is exclusive to life or dependent upon life. Consciousness is not subjective experience. Consciousness is not perception. And consciousness is not a private thing, something that you own, that's personal to you, like you are a thing which has consciousness. That's not what it is. Consciousness is not a thing that other things have. Consciousness is also not occurring within space and time. So those are some pretty bold claims. And this goes counter to the entire materialist paradigm, which is trying to understand what consciousness is. And you can see that if consciousness, let's just assume for a moment that what I'm saying here is true, that consciousness is not any of these things. Well, if that's true, then you can see that the materialist paradigm assumes that this is what consciousness is all these things that I just said it's not. So you could see that it's already starting off on a very wrong footing, and it's going to have to work really hard to untangle this mess. So then, what is consciousness? Well, it's very tricky. Simple but tricky. Consciousness is actually not anything. It is not a thing. It is nothing. It's actually nothing. But this nothing is not what you think the ordinary word nothing means. Because when we ordinarily say nothing, we think of non-existence. That's not what consciousness is. I am not saying that consciousness does not exist. That's actually, I think, Daniel Dennett's position, technically, is he thinks consciousness is an illusion, so it does not exist. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that consciousness is the only thing that exists. It is existence itself, and what that is nothing. Existence is nothing, but it exists. It's not non-existence, it exists. Consciousness is pure existence without content. So imagine if you took all the attributes and qualities of life out of existence, you would think that what you're left with is non-existence and not consciousness. But actually, it turns out that what you're left with is pure consciousness. The problem is that you need to become conscious enough to become conscious of consciousness without any attributes or any content. And that's a little challenging to do for most minds. That requires some work. Another way we can say it is that consciousness is the substance of everything. So what is everything made out of? Look around you right now. Look around the room. Look at objects around you. Maybe you see a table, a couch, a cat, a tree, a car, a window, some sunlight, your body. You're hearing me talk. This is all consciousness. It's all occurring within consciousness. That's the substance of reality. Reality is not made out of atoms or energy or anything else. It's made out of consciousness. And the function of consciousness is to be totally empty. So that's why it's so difficult to talk about and to grasp, because it's emptiness. It's actual emptiness. But this emptiness exists. The reason it needs to be empty is because it needs to be able to take on the attributes of every possible object. You see, if consciousness wasn't empty, if it had some sort of attribute, like let's say consciousness was red, or let's say consciousness was big, or consciousness was small, or consciousness was cold, or rough, or smooth, or ethereal, or solid, or material. See, any of those things would be an attribute. So if consciousness had any of those attributes, then that would prevent it from being able to be the opposite of that. You see, so if consciousness, let's say, was big, that means it couldn't be small as well. And if consciousness was rough, then it couldn't be smooth. And if consciousness was red, it couldn't be green. You see how this works? So what we really need, if we want to construct reality from scratch, is we need some sort of container or substrate, which is ideally completely free of any attributes whatsoever. It has no properties at all. It's even free of time and space, such that we could fill this container with absolutely anything we wanted. It was a totally free container. So it would be sort of like if we were a painter and we wanted to paint a beautiful painting, what would we choose as our medium? Would we take some famous painting by Da Vinci and use that to paint on? No. You can't paint on an already painted canvas. You need a blank canvas to do that. But what that means is then it's difficult for you as a human being then, who is situated within consciousness. You see, you have attributes. You have a size, you have a shape, you are a certain way. So now it's difficult for you to grasp the empty canvas on which you were painted. So to really understand consciousness, there needs to be a paradigm shift. You need to be able to look around you and to see that everything that you're interacting with, every object, no matter what kind of qualities it has, no matter how solid it feels, a concrete wall, a brick, a steel beam, all of those are made out of consciousness. So what this means is that the universe is not just some dumb collection of molecules bouncing around in a box, the way that science conventionally conceives of it, but that the universe is conscious. And that is the key step that the neuroscientists and the materialists and the rationalists do not want to make. To them, that shatters their entire metaphysics of what reality is. And granted, that's a very big paradigm shift. And many people do not want to accept this because, well, it has a lot of ramifications for how you interact with reality. And so, of course, that makes you apprehensive. I can appreciate that. So what I'm saying here is that consciousness is not localized. It does not occur within space. It does not occur within your skull or within a brain. Consciousness is universal. The entire universe is consciousness. Another way to say it is that the entire universe is one giant mind, and that every object that you see within reality is a figment of imagination of this giant mind. Now, this is a move and an admission that the materialists and rationalists want to make even less. Because conventionally speaking, reality is not supposed to be a giant mind. Reality is supposed to be dumb. But then ask yourself, why would you assume that? Why is it necessary that reality starts out dumb? Why couldn't reality start out smart? Why couldn't it be a mind? And of course, you have a lot of good reasons for why you think it can't. Predominantly because it feels so solid and so consistent and so real. You think that if reality was a mind, then everything would be loosey-goosey and fantastical. But then again, ask yourself, is what you're experiencing right now not fantastical? You're alive, you exist. Look at all this amazing stuff that's happening around you. It's utterly remarkable. You just take it for granted because you've been alive for so many decades that you take it for granted. But when you were born, it was all magical and incredible, and none of it made any sense. It was all fantastical. There was no such thing as seeing a dog walking down the street and not being fascinated and blown away by it. It was incredible. And you can still go see incredible things. You can see incredible documentaries. You go out into nature. You can explore the cosmos, and you will find incredible, fantastical, miraculous, amazing things. And scientists are discovering these things every single day, and they have been for the entire span of human civilization. The problem is that we just get so numb to it, and we start to take it for granted, and then we set up this sort of division between like the truly fantastical, the stuff of Alice in Wonderland, and then the more down-to-earth. But the down-to-earth stuff is still extremely fantastical. And you got to wonder, where did it all come from? And how is it functioning all so well and so efficiently? And it's not just because it's a clock or atoms bouncing around in a box following logical rules. It's way, way, way more nuanced than that. There's an intelligence to it. It is a mind. And you can actually become conscious that reality is a mind. After all, that's why you can think. See, right now you think that you're a human being sitting here who has consciousness. And what I'm telling you is that you're not that. What you are is you are the universe being conscious and thinking that it's a human being. Can you try to make that shift? It's a recontextualization of your present experience. So look around you right now, look around the room, and just try to notice that what you are is not a human being looking at a room. What you are is the universe that is precipitating this room and your body and everything else, and there it is. It's both a subtle and a radical shift. So another way to think about consciousness is think of it as infinite clay. I like this analogy. So think of clay. We can use clay to make a shape. And what's cool about clay is that, literally, think about this. Ordinary clay, in a sense, is infinite because you can use ordinary clay to construct an infinite number of different sculptures or shapes. You can make pots, you can make vases, you can make people and animals of any kind. You can make aliens, you can make all sorts of fantastical stuff. There is no limitation to what you can carve out of clay. Except, of course, there's a problem with clay because ordinary clay has properties, which is why it's easy for us to make sense of it. You know, ordinary clay has a certain mass, a certain weight, a certain viscosity, a certain pliability, a certain color, a certain texture, smoothness, roughness. It's got a certain temperature. It's got a certain size. It expands. It reacts to cold and to water in certain ways. So in a sense, this makes it limited. It's unlimited in a certain dimension in that you can make all sorts of infinite shapes from it. But for example, you can't make it infinite colors because unless you color it with paint, let's say you're not doing that. If you just take the clay and you don't modify it in any way, it has whatever color it has, right? So you can make an infinite number of sculptures, but all of them will have the same color. And also, practically, it's limited in that there's only certain shapes and sizes of sculptures you can make out of clay because it'll just collapse in on itself. You can't make a really long, thin object. It'll collapse. And if you make a sculpture that's too big, eventually the entire sculpture will just crumble down under gravity, under its own weight. So you have some practical limitations there. But now, imagine this. Imagine if we were able to create a clay that was truly infinite. Out of this clay, we could create anything in reality. This would be like the ultimate substance. What would that substance or clay look like? So immediately you should see that it should look a lot like nothing. So that the properties of the clay itself do not interfere with the ability to create something out of it, you see. So our clay, our infinite clay, cannot have a color because if we gave it some color, that means it would be that color and all objects would then be that color. That would be very limiting because we want to be able to create all the colors that we see. So in that case, we need to start off with 0 so that we can add in whatever colors we wanted to, or create that out of the clay. And of course, it would have to have no smell, because we would want to be able to create any kind of smell we wanted to out of this clay, metaphorically speaking. We would want it to have no texture, no size, no mass, and nothing else. And then if we were able to create this magical sounding clay, it sounds magical, doesn't it? Then look what we've got. We've got a shapeshifter. We've got a shape-shifting substance, consciousness, that we can use to create anything. We could use it to create a rock, a tree, a car, metal, plastic, paper, plasma, a cloud, cold, hot, red, blue, big, small, dumb, smart, hairy, bald, round, sharp, solid, liquid, transparent, shiny, dull, smooth, rough, soft, hard. It would be unlimited. You can make anything you want out of it. Now, the only problem is that what I'm saying sounds extremely fantastical to you. It sounds impossible. Leo, how could that be possible? But then again, how could anything be possible? How is it possible that there are atoms bouncing around in a box? Where do they come from? How is the Big Bang possible? This question of how is it possible is a very sneaky question, because what it assumes is that whatever model of reality you have, that you are kind of like taking it for granted. But what you have to realize is that any model of reality you have, whichever way you think reality is, it's equally incredible. How is anything possible? That's the whole trick. Now, of course, I'm not trying to logically convince you with this analogy that what I'm saying is correct. I'm just using this analogy to help to explain something that you can become conscious of. This is something you can become directly conscious of, that consciousness is this shape-shifting substance. But the materialist paradigm just refuses to understand this. And here I want to show you a quote from Stephen Hawking, who is a perfect representative example of what I mean by the materialist paradigm. See, he says, quote, "I think the brain is essentially a computer, and consciousness is like a computer program. It will cease to run when the computer is turned off. Theoretically, it could be recreated on a neural network, but that would be very difficult as it would require all of one's memories." End quote. Now, be honest, is that how you think of consciousness? As software running on computer hardware? This is a very popular analogy that a lot of people fall prey to these days. And it really prevents you from going further in understanding and exploring what consciousness is. Because consciousness is not like software running on hardware. Instead, consciousness is more like software which can run without needing hardware. It's just pure software. So rather than thinking of the world as a combination of hardware and software, the way that most people do, you think there's like hard external physical reality, and then there's all the software. The software is like your emotions, and it's your perceptions. Everything you're seeing here right now supposedly is the software, right? Your perceptions. That's what neuroscience would tell you. All these colors, what are these colors? What are these feelings and emotions in your body? What is this sensation of sitting on a chair or standing on your feet? What is that? We would say, that's software, right? But then the hardware is the stuff underneath. That's the stuff that physics studies, is the hardware. And the software runs on the hardware. Except the problem is that philosophers for the last 2,000 years have been trying to explain, even in theory, how it's possible that software can run on hardware, how it's possible that atoms and molecules can give rise to colors and emotions and sensations and feelings and thoughts and ideas and all this kind of soft stuff, which is technically called qualia in philosophy of mind. They call it qualia. How does qualia arise out of matter? Or, of course, this is the classic mind-body problem that Descartes made famous. How does mind arise from body? Well, it doesn't, because all there is mind. Body is a feature of mind. Body is a special case of mind. So imagine a computer that is purely software. It requires no hardware. The universe is just pure software floating in nothingness. That's what we're talking about. Otherwise, in philosophy, this is known as idealism. But of course, what I'm talking about is not just a philosophy. I'm talking about, yes, a philosophy, but I'm talking about actually discovering that it's true. Speaking of which, I recently had this incredible experience of discovering that everything is consciousness, very palpably. In what seemed like a moment, I looked around the room, and it was just blindingly obvious that everything I'm looking at is pure consciousness. Every object. And I was so blown away by this that I picked up a book that was lying next to me, and I just flipped through the book, and it was just glaringly obvious that every single page on that book is pure consciousness. I'm just consciousness flipping through consciousness. I looked at my hand, and it's just pure consciousness. I looked at a metal fork, and then it's obvious that, yes, it's made out of metal, and the metal is made out of iron atoms, but what are the iron atoms made out of? Consciousness. Consciousness is this field which is the substance of everything. And that's really how you realize non-duality, is that you see the underlying essence behind everything. You see of what the ancients called quintessence. You know, they had five, the classic four elements is fire, earth, water, and what's the other one? Air, wind, let's say. And then there's the fifth element. What is the fifth element? It's quintessence. Quint, fifth element. Quintessence. But what is quintessence? How come no one's been able to find the quintessence? Because it's nothingness, which is not the same thing as air. And it's not the same thing as non-existence. It's nothingness or consciousness. Now, you might wonder, well, Leo, why do you call it consciousness if it's nothingness? Well, that's a hell of a thing to explain. Because when I say nothing, I'm talking about a different thing than what you're thinking of. What you're thinking of when I say nothing is you're thinking of an empty space devoid of any qualities or features, and it's just sort of like a dumb physical space. Like if physics explains nothingness, it's just a space, like a vacuum. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that it's mind stuff. It's conscious of itself. It's alive. It's intelligent. It's self-aware. And that's amazing. It's amazing to discover that reality is actually self-aware and that it's actually intelligent. That makes absolutely no sense from the materialist paradigm. That's right, because we're talking about a different paradigm. You see, you have one paradigm, the material paradigm, and I'm telling you, just drop that. It doesn't work, and switch to a different paradigm. That means you're looking at the world from a totally different perspective. And everything you see still sort of remains the same, but it's also recontextualized. So to help you understand this, it's useful to make a distinction between first order versus second order reality. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take the materialist scientific paradigm. From that paradigm, when you look at reality, you split it up into at least two orders. The first order is the most fundamental. So science says that the first order reality, the most real stuff that we know, is atoms, energy, the universe itself, the physical universe, the body, and the brain. That's first order. Second order would be consciousness, perceptions, the mind, and emotions. These would be called the emergent phenomena. They don't really exist. Consciousness doesn't really exist. Perceptions don't really exist. The mind doesn't really exist. Emotions don't really exist. All of those just boil down to atoms and neurons. That's one way to see the world. Let's take a look at another paradigm, the dream paradigm. When you're dreaming, inside of your dream, there's also a first order and second order reality. The first order reality is the mind. It's the mind space within which your dream is happening. That's what a dream is made out of. It's the substance of the dream. And then there's the second order reality, which is all the contents of your dream. So if you see monsters and ghosts and old relatives, and you see fantastical stuff happening to you, weird stories and narratives and memories and all that kind of wacky stuff, That's the content. But that's all second order, right? Because we say all of that is happening inside the mind. Now, the mistake that happens with the dream paradigm is that when a materialist sees the dream paradigm, he can't help himself but to look at it from the materialist paradigm. So what he'll say is that, yeah, Leo, but a dream is really happening inside the brain. And so actually, the reality of a dream is not mind, it's brain. But that's not the dream paradigm. That's the materialist paradigm. So forget that. We've already talked about that one. Now I'm talking about the dream paradigm. That's a different paradigm. Inside the dream paradigm, there is no brain. The dream is not happening inside of a brain. It's mind space. That's a different paradigm. Now let's consider the third paradigm, a TV paradigm, the television paradigm. So when you're looking at a television screen, there is first order and second order reality. The first order reality is the pixels of the screen. The second order reality is all the stuff the pixels depict. It's all the actors, it's the stage, it's the props. And then we could even go one step further. We could say there's even a third order reality to a TV, which is the story that is told by the movie, for example. See, because the story of a movie, it's not identical to the actors, the stage, and the props. It's made out of those things. See, so that would be like a third order. It's how you arrange the actors, the stage, and the props, and the environment, and the dialogue. It's how you arrange all those things, and then that leads to sort of the emergence of a story. But all those things are ultimately pixels. You see? And then lastly, there's the non-duality paradigm, which is what's actually real, what's actually true. And in this paradigm, first order reality is consciousness, and second order reality is all the stuff that you know as physical objects. Human beings, the sun, trees, cars, houses, gravity, the laws of physics, science itself, the entire universe, the Big Bang, your body, your brain, thoughts, emotions, sexuality, politics, government, war, violence, rape, genocide, love and happiness, all of this. What is all of this? This is all happening within consciousness. All of that is second order. First order is consciousness. All those things are interconnected because the substance of all those things is consciousness. The tricky thing about consciousness is that it cannot be pointed to because it holds all the pointers. In the same way that, imagine if you were a character on a TV screen. Imagine if you were Mario from Super Mario World. Can Mario use his finger to point at the pixels of the screen? He can't. You notice this? You can't do that if you were Mario. Because Mario is in a sort of dimension which is tangential to the pixels. Mario doesn't know about the pixels. He's made out of the pixels. Mario's hand is made out of pixels. It's being displayed by pixels in the same way that my hand right now is inside of empty consciousness. So my finger cannot point to consciousness because the finger itself cannot point outside. It can't go meta, you see, because it is made out of the pixels. No matter where Mario points, he's never going to be able to point out a pixel because he's made out of pixels. In the same way, when you start to look for consciousness, like, Leo, where is this consciousness you keep talking about? You look for it, but you can't grasp it because you're in it. You're the fish in water. Another metaphor might be that if you have a white piece of paper and you draw like Mickey Mouse on it or something, Mickey Mouse cannot point outside at the paper itself. You see, you can draw Mickey Mouse pointing around in the scene of that two-dimensional space, but he cannot point out to the third dimension. This is the classic self-reference problem. which creates strange loops, which I talked about in my episode called Reality is a Strange Loop. And it is that, which is why you can't point at it, but you are it. You can't point at consciousness, which also means that you can't grasp it with words, or you can't grasp it with the mind or with the intellect or using concepts, because all those things are occurring within consciousness. But you are consciousness. You are that emptiness within which everything is occurring, which is why when you look inside of yourself, if you ask yourself, who am I? What am I? You look inside yourself, what do you find? Emptiness. You don't find a thing in there. Emptiness. Look inside. Try to go turn your awareness back around, look into your skull. What do you see inside your skull? You don't see a skull in there. You see emptiness. That's consciousness. But you need to really train your mind on that to become conscious of that consciousness, of what it really is. So the reason I make a big deal about this pointing business is because if what I'm saying is true, that means that nobody can tell you what consciousness is, because talking uses words in communication. Those are pointers, which is why a Zen master uses koans and riddles to try to point consciousness out to you, because actually you can't point it out. You either get it or you don't. You're either conscious of it or you're not. Which is why what scientists are attempting to do, which is to create models of consciousness, this is what neuroscientists are doing, it's never going to work. The only way you can know consciousness is by becoming conscious, because consciousness is what's fundamental. And your mind and your language and your science, which is only possible with language. You cannot do science without language and without concepts. It's second order. You see, the problem is that you're trying to use a second order phenomenon to get at the first order. You got it backwards. It's not going to work. It turns out that there is no substitute for consciousness. You cannot substitute for consciousness with intelligence, with IQ, with beliefs, with knowledge, or with intuition even. Because consciousness is the substance of all of those things. Intelligence and beliefs and knowledge and intuition, these are second order. First order is consciousness. So now let's get into some frequently asked questions and objections, because I know that there's a lot of these when it comes to this topic. And I had a lot of these questions and objections when I started to learn about consciousness and non-duality and how all this stuff works. And I've resolved a lot of these for myself recently, so I want to help you to do the same. So first question is, Leo, what is consciousness made out of? Consciousness is made out of itself. Now that's an odd answer. How could consciousness be made out of itself? And what does that even mean? It sounds like it's just some woo-woo talk. It sounds like I'm not saying anything when I say that. But really think about it. Whatever you think reality is made out of, think about it. What's the most fundamental thing that you believe reality is made of? Atoms, quarks, strings, energy, whatever it is, doesn't matter. At some point, you're going to get to the bottom end, like to the bottom line. You're going to hit rock bottom. So let's say it's just for simplicity's sake, it's made of atoms. Okay. And atoms are indivisible. That's not true, but let's say that's true. So if it's atoms, what are these atoms made out of? You're going to have to say the same thing, that atoms just are and nothing more. That's rock bottom. So that's sort of what we're saying about consciousness. It's rock bottom. You can't get below that. But actually, in a way, you can. Because when you become fully conscious of consciousness, you realize that the rock bottom is nothingness. And nothingness is itself. Existence is itself. And therefore, it just is. And that's the bottom line. But this is not sort of like an intellectual exercise in the same way that atoms are understood. Because with atoms, you can say, yeah, atoms, we don't know what atoms are made out of. they're irreducible, they just are that way. Stop asking stupid questions. That's not what I'm telling you here. I'm not saying that you can't get to the bottom of consciousness. I'm saying you can get to the bottom of consciousness. You can get to the bottom of reality. And what you find there is nothing. But that's not the same nothing that the scientists think that strings or quarks are made out of. It's actual nothing. And you can be conscious of it. So it's a strange loop. Reality is made out of itself. And you might say, how is that possible? And the answer is because everything is possible and it has no limits. Consciousness is unlimited, so it can do anything, literally anything that it wants. And so it gives birth to itself. It's sort of like consciousness is its own mother and its own father. Kind of an interesting twist on the time travel paradox where you go back in time and you give birth to yourself by having sex with your grandmother or something like that. Yeah, that's basically how consciousness came into being. It's sort of like went back in time and had sex with itself, and it gave birth to itself. It's a mindfuck. Next question. How come if I damage my brain, I will lose consciousness? This is a tricky one. This is a tricky one to help you to understand. Yes, it's true that if you damage your brain, you could lose consciousness. However, I'm not talking about that per se here. So when I use the word consciousness, I'm not talking about consciousness that it's something you have. See, the way you frame it here metaphysically, when you say, I will lose consciousness, you assume that consciousness is something you had to begin with, which is not the case. So let's think of it this way. Let's bring in the Lego analogy. We're using a lot of analogies here to explain this. So the Lego analogy. And this is actually a really good analogy for explaining first order versus second order reality. So we have Lego blocks, right? Let's assume that the Lego blocks are just the most fundamental particles. And we can use Lego blocks to build a castle. So we build this beautiful castle. The shape of the castle, that's a second order reality. The blocks themselves that make up the castle, that's first order reality. Okay. So here's what's going on when you think that you lose consciousness by damaging your brain. It's actually like this. You've taken these Legos and you've built a beautiful castle. And now what you've done is you've identified consciousness and yourself with the castle, which is a mistake because actually consciousness is the Lego blocks themselves, but you're not conscious of that yet. So you've identified yourself with the shape of the castle. So when that shape breaks down, which is what happens when we take a hammer and hit you over the skull and damage your brain, what that amounts to is taking a sledgehammer and hitting the castle. What happens? A bunch of the blocks break off and you ruin the shape of the castle. And then you say to yourself, oh, look, I've lost my consciousness. My consciousness has been damaged. No, it hasn't. What's happened is that the thing you identified with, you've misidentified, that thing has been damaged. The content within consciousness, that has been damaged, let's say. But consciousness itself will always be there. In fact, we could deconstruct the entire castle such that the castle no longer exists. But the consciousness, the building blocks, they're still there. You cannot destroy the building blocks in this analogy. Next question. How can there be consciousness without a brain? This is also very difficult to explain to someone who's stuck in the materialist paradigm. Well, I could ask you the same question. How is it possible that there could be consciousness with a brain? Man, why do you assume that that's just a given, that that's obvious? Because mankind has been investigating this question both theoretically and experimentally for over 2,000 years, and we still haven't figured it out. So maybe that's a clue that your paradigm is backwards. It makes no sense how consciousness could be possible with a brain. How is it possible that there are atoms? How is that possible? How is it possible there's a universe? How is materialism possible? When you really step back and you remove all of your biases and you stop taking anything for granted, and you really objectively evaluate all of these different paradigms, you will see that they're all equally fantastical. There's nothing more fantastical, for example, about reality being a giant mind versus reality being just a bunch of dumb particles bouncing around in a box. Because you still have to account for the dumb particles and the box. Where did the box come from? Where did time come from? Where did space come from? Where did the physical laws of the universe come from? Where did the physical constants come from? Like the gravitational constant and so on. Where did they come from? Of course, science has no explanation, nor is there even an explanation on the horizon, even in theory. It's not possible because you're always taking something for granted. You're always starting off with something, an axiom or an assumption of some kind, or something that you hold as reality. But see, in this example, we're questioning much deeper than most scientists or even most philosophers ever question. So we're getting into uncharted territories for most minds. So, see, one of the problems with the English word consciousness is that it's not just a word for some idea. It comes with an implicit metaphysics. And what's implicit to the definition of that word is that when people hear consciousness or a mind, they automatically bring in with it the metaphysics of a brain. They just assume that minds and consciousnesses must happen in brains. Duh. But why would you assume that? Really think about that. Think about that existentially from ground zero, without any kind of assumptions. Why would mind or consciousness need a brain to begin with? If you really investigate that, what you'll discover is actually, maybe they don't. Maybe the problem is the way that I'm defining consciousness. Maybe consciousness it exists, but it doesn't depend upon some mechanism that brings it about. And that turns out to be the case. Another question is, Leo, how come I lose consciousness when I go to sleep? Doesn't that prove that the universe is not conscious? Because supposedly if the universe was always conscious, then I wouldn't be able to go to sleep. Again, this is because you misidentify what consciousness is. Again, you're holding it as something that you lose. You're going to sleep and you're losing it. That assumed that you had it to begin with, which you didn't. Again, what's happening when you're going to sleep is that since you're identified with this castle that you've built out of Lego blocks, when you go to sleep at night, the entire castle gets disassembled and it just becomes Lego blocks. But since you are at that level of consciousness where you're not identified with the blocks, you're identified with the castle, to you it appears as though the castle disappears. And it does from that perspective. And from that perspective, it appears like you lose consciousness and that there's nothing left. But if you become sufficiently conscious and you shift your identification from being the castle, the second order, to the first order, the building blocks, then you will actually be able to keep your consciousness even when you go to sleep, even when there's nothing there, even after your physical body dies. But of course, it's not going to be the kind of consciousness that you've identified with right here. It's not going to be all colorful and fanciful and stuff's going to be happening. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be pure consciousness, pure, with no attributes whatsoever. And most people confuse that with non-existence, but actually it's just pure existence. Next question. How come I'm not conscious of other minds? If, Leo, you say that the universe is conscious and that's all that there is, then supposedly I should have access to all information and to everything. No, why would you assume that? So again, let's use our building block analogy with Legos. Let's imagine that we've built an entire house out of Legos, like a house, real life scale house out of Legos. That would be quite a big project, but let's say we did that. And we have different rooms in this house. We have the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, the bedroom, the bathroom, all this sort of stuff. You see, we can use our building blocks, if we're clever, in such a way that we can sort of create a bubble. In fact, we could create a room that has no doors and no windows, such that from within that room, let's say we create the bathroom, and the bathroom has no doors or windows. We completely seal it in with cement and drywall and everything and paint it over with wallpaper so it looks nice. You can't see any seams. So now imagine if you could take the point of view of the bathroom itself. It would appear that the bathroom exists all by itself and that the bathroom is separate from all the other rooms in the house. But of course, if you zoom out, like if you're the constructor of this thing, you know that the bathroom is there and it appears to be isolated from every other room. It can't see the bathroom can't see all the other rooms. And yet at the same time, it's all one house. You see? In fact, we don't really even need to seal the room off. It's interesting. This house example is very interesting because, see, we construct boundaries. It's all about how your mind draws these boundaries. In an ordinary house, do you notice that every room is completely connected to every other room? There's no separation between rooms in a house. Even if it has doors, there's still no separation. And in fact, in most houses, the kitchen, the dining room, and the living room are just one giant space, with some distortions and contortions and convolutions, but it's just one space. Like in my apartment, my kitchen and my living room and even my office, which is technically the dining area, it's just all one space. And that space even continues further on. It goes into the hallway, it goes into the bedroom, it goes into my bathroom, it goes into my closet. So you see, these distinctions we make between the kitchen, the dining room, the bedroom, the bathroom, these are constructions of our minds. There's no hard and fast distinctions. I dare you to go throughout your house and to find the precise place where your kitchen splits off from your living room and where your living room splits off from your bathroom. Pinpoint the precise place. See, you can't because these boundaries are artificial. They're constructed by the mind. They're projected onto reality. And so what you can realize is, see, before you thought of your house as just being these separate rooms, but then you realize, oh no, it's all one house. That's exactly what other minds are like. It feels that you are trapped in this bubble and that you have no access to other people's thoughts and emotions and so forth. But really, it's just because you're really identified with this bubble, the appearances that create this bubble. And if your consciousness expands, it can expand beyond that, and you can understand that you are all minds without necessarily having to access all the other minds. You see, the bathroom doesn't need to become the kitchen to understand that the entire house is all interconnected. It's sort of a weird way to phrase it because bathrooms can't think, but you kind of get the analogy that I'm talking about. Okay, next question. How can matter be conscious? Well, it should be obvious by this point that what I'm saying is that matter cannot be conscious. Consciousness is not something that arises out of matter or neurons. Matter and neurons are something that are occurring within consciousness. So you got that backwards. Next question. Doesn't matter affect consciousness? Again, this gets things backwards. Matter doesn't affect consciousness. Matter is consciousness, and consciousness is interacting with itself. So does matter interact with other matter? Of course. Of course it does. And you perfectly allow that. Why don't you ask the question, how can matter affect other matter? How come a table is affected by a ball if I drop it on the ball, or I drop the ball on the table? How come? See, you just take that for granted. Physics takes that for granted. But that's a mysterious thing, if you think about it. So when I say that consciousness affects and interacts with consciousness, because consciousness is all there is, so it has nothing to interact with but itself. So consciousness interacts with consciousness. And you might say, but Leo, that makes no sense. But notice that matter interacting with matter also makes no sense. So yeah, it doesn't make sense because it's mysterious, because reality is mysterious. It's fundamentally mysterious. So when you're trying to demystify reality, in truth, you can't. Only by an act of self-delusion or lack of consciousness can you demystify reality. You can't. You accept that matter can interact with matter. No problems. Well, now just realize that matter is consciousness, and the other matter is also consciousness, so now you have consciousness interacting with consciousness. It's not that difficult to accept that. Next, next question. Why does consciousness exist? That's a hell of a question. Why does consciousness exist? Consciousness is existence. Consciousness is not something that comes into existence. It is existence itself. So you are basically asking, why does existence exist? And the answer is because there is nothing but existence. Where else would it be? Non-existence does not exist. Non-existence is a concept. Let me correct that. Let me be very precise here. It's not that non-existence doesn't exist. Non-existence is a concept that exists within existence. There is actually no such thing as non-existence. There is only existence. And why this is the case becomes very clear when you become fully conscious of what consciousness is. But until then, it will probably not make much sense, what I just said. Another question, how did consciousness evolve in animals? Consciousness did not evolve in animals. Animals and evolution are things that are occurring within consciousness. You see the difference there? Another question, can a rock be conscious? Or is a rock conscious? A rock is not conscious. A rock is inside of consciousness. Can a computer be conscious? This is a very interesting question that I've pondered. Again, you have to understand what a computer is. A computer is not made out of matter in a physical universe. A computer is a figment of universal mind. A computer is something that's occurring within consciousness. And because the entire universe is conscious, I would assume that it's possible for any object within the universe to become self-aware. So what you're really asking when you're talking about a computer is you're sort of asking, like, can an artificial intelligence become self-aware? And the trick with that question is that what you're really asking about, you're not asking whether it can become conscious. What you're actually asking about is, can it develop an ego, a sense of self, the way that you did? Of course, the ego is an illusion. Your sense of self is an illusion, which is what's preventing you from realizing what consciousness is. So here's what would happen. If a computer developed an ego, and I believe it can, probably, I don't know for sure, probably it can, then what would happen is at that instant where it developed an ego, what that ego does is that ego will appropriate absolute being, consciousness. It will appropriate that for itself, and it will claim that it is conscious. See, that's what the ego does fundamentally. The ego takes ownership over consciousness, where in fact consciousness is absolute and universal. The ego localizes it, and it takes ownership of it. And in that case, it would become just as deluded as most human beings are. And then it would have all the difficulties and struggles that we have with spirituality. So I think that's probably possible, but we're probably far away from that for now. mostly because people who are doing artificial intelligence research and neuroscientists who are working on these issues, they have a completely wrong paradigm. They don't understand what consciousness is. So until they really understand what consciousness is, and they're not even close to that, because their entire foundation, metaphysical foundation, is backwards, I think we're going to be far away from having true egotistical artificial intelligences. Although, who knows? I might be wrong. Next question, are consciousness and awareness the same thing? This is an interesting question. I was going to shoot a whole episode about this, actually. But maybe I'll just address it here. Different teachers and people can use words in different ways. So you have to be careful. Sometimes teachers will use these words synonymously, like I do. Sometimes teachers will make very fine-grained distinctions between these two, and they will actually mean two different things by these words. Personally, for me, I don't like making these very fine-grained distinctions because it's lost on students and it becomes confusing. So I just use consciousness and awareness basically synonymously. So when you hear me talking about this stuff, I will use those words interchangeably, and they basically mean the same thing for me. But when you're reading other teachers, try to get inside their head and try to understand, what are they talking about? In what context are they using that word? It's very important. Otherwise, you might misunderstand them. Next question. Leo, how can you be so sure that there isn't something beyond consciousness? Because when you become fully conscious of what consciousness is, you realize that consciousness is infinite and that there are no boundaries. And so therefore, you understand that there is nothing beyond, because consciousness includes everything that's beyond itself. That's what's so interesting about it. So anything you can imagine that's beyond consciousness is consciousness. It's really that simple. Because see, in order for something to be beyond consciousness, that means you would have to draw a boundary between consciousness and not consciousness. But there is no such thing as not consciousness, despite what the materialist paradigm tells you. See, the problem with the materialist paradigm is that it makes it seem as though there's conscious things and there's not conscious things. There's the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. There's no such thing as the unconscious mind, and there's no such thing as unconscious things. Everything is conscious or it doesn't exist. Next question. So then, Leo, if neuroscience is false, like you're saying, is it useless? Well, first of all, not all neuroscience is false. There are some good studies that neuroscientists do, and I think it's a good field that needs to continue to do its work. I am not talking about abandoning neuroscience. I'm talking about actually correcting the metaphysical foundations of neuroscience so that it can do its own work more effectively. That's what I'm trying to help neuroscience figure itself out. I don't think it's useless. I think there's a lot of important stuff that we can learn from neuroscience. In fact, my hope is that maybe within the next 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, once neuroscience makes this paradigm shift into non-duality, which it must, it will, it'll just be forced to. It can't deny the obvious forever. So once mainstream science comes along, there's going to be a huge paradigm shift within the field of neuroscience. Non-duality, it will go from duality into non-duality. Then from that framework, there will be a revolution within neuroscience. There will be a lot of amazing discoveries. And my hope is that neuroscientists will be able to discover a way to induce enlightenment either chemically or surgically, very quickly and easily, such that you can just go to the doctor. He just snips some stuff in your brain, snips out the default mode network, whatever, and you just walk out the next day and you're fully enlightened, and it's super easy. And you don't need to listen to any of these videos. You just walk around like a full Buddha, and everything's hunky dory. I think we can get there one day. We just have to really understand how the brain works, and that's tricky because, see, the brain is in a strange loop relationship with perceptions and with consciousness and with reality. And so very carefully untwining that strange loop is going to be very tricky. But, that's what science is all about. It's all about dealing with this strange loop. And it's amazing how successful science can be in certain domains. Next question. Leo, how do I become more conscious? That would probably be the whole point of all this discussion, is for you to understand that consciousness is what you're really after in life and that you should be pursuing more of it. How do you become more conscious? Well, basically by focusing consciousness on itself. Consciousness turned on itself can become self-conscious because the property of consciousness is self-awareness. In fact, it's the only thing that can really be self-aware. So how do you do that? Well, there's various methods. Yoga, many different schools of yoga, meditation, many kinds of meditation, self-inquiry, psychedelics, contemplation, all these techniques that I've talked about and that I will continue to talk about. You just got to do them. And you got to do them with discipline and with focus and with concentration, not just slacking around. And the last question, Leo, how can there be different levels of consciousness? If everything is consciousness, it seems like you're talking about like these building blocks like Legos, but these Legos, I mean, do you have different levels of Legos? That doesn't make any sense. And sometimes you talk about consciousness as though there's different levels. Well, yeah, that's tricky to answer that. Because I do sometimes talk about consciousness as though there are different levels of it. Like I say, you can raise your consciousness or you can become more conscious. When I say that, I'm sort of speaking from the relative perspective, but then from the absolute perspective, when you become fully conscious, so to speak, you realize that actually everything is consciousness and it's just one, and there's really sort of not levels of consciousness. So it's kind of twisted. It's like there are and there aren't levels of consciousness. Sometimes people criticize me by saying that, oh, Leo, you shouldn't tell people there are levels of consciousness because everything is just one. Right, but it's still very useful to be able to break it down into levels. It's just very useful. So I do talk about it like that. Like I'll talk about spiral dynamics and I'll say that the spiral dynamics stages are all different levels of consciousness. And even though in the absolute sense that's false, in the relative sense it's a very useful model and it works. And so, we have to sort of like claw our way out of this deep well that we're drowning in. So, we're sort of just pragmatically using whatever conceptual tools we can to help us climb out. And so one of those tools is these different levels of consciousness. And so consciousness can also sort of kind of expand and contract. I don't know how to really explain how or why it does that, but it just has this ability. Like it can sort of be dumb or it can be smart. It can be self-aware or it can kind of like lack self-awareness. It's rather interesting and mysterious. So there are a lot of different synonyms that people use for consciousness and that I use. So to me, these are all synonymous. Consciousness, awareness, nothing, everything, infinity, reality, God, you, emptiness, void, Brahman, mu, formlessness, form, awakeness, absolute, and being. All of these words are basically synonymous. They're pointing to the same thing, but perhaps different aspects or facets of the same thing. See, the twisted thing about nothingness is that it has facets to it. But how do you explain that? Because I told you that nothingness has no attributes. But then again, it does have attributes. It has attributes like intelligence. It has attributes like infinity. It has attributes sort of like love, but it's sort of like a cosmic sort of love. So yeah, it's difficult to explain this stuff. You need to actually start to experience it. All right, so as we conclude, let me just give you last couple of pointers, very practical things that you should know about consciousness. Firstly, there are many different levels of consciousness. And the level of consciousness that you are at on a daily basis is what dictates all of your actions, all of your emotions, how you feel, and what you do in life. So if you want to be able to predict what a human being is going to do throughout his life, just look at his level of consciousness. That is the determining factor. If you care about morality and being a good human being, the most important factor that morality hinges on is not rules, or it's not a tradition you believe in. It's not your personal manifesto or principles. It's your level of consciousness. If you have low consciousness, but very lofty ideals, and you follow the 10 Commandments, you're still going to be an evil, selfish person, because that's what low consciousness is about. It's about selfishness. Whereas if you have high levels of consciousness, you realize the self is an illusion, then it doesn't matter what kind of books you read or what kind of principles you have, you're going to be a pretty kind, decent, and loving person. The most loving people are the most conscious people, and vice versa. Although it's not always a perfect correlation. It is possible that highly conscious people still do selfish things because they're still people, and their minds are still selfish. And even if you're highly conscious, you still have to survive in the world. And so survival is selfishness. You cannot survive without being selfish. So you're stuck with it unless you want to depart this world early, and you can always do that if you want to. But in that case, we won't be talking about you because we won't know that you exist. Another point for you here is that make sure you understand that altered states of consciousness are possible, and that there's a wide variety of them. There's not just one or two. There are many different kinds and types, and also many degrees to each kind and type, which is what makes spirituality so complicated, is because to study all these different states and all the different depths of these states is a lifelong work, and very few people have accessed all the different states that exist. And probably most people cannot access all the states. Some people access some of these states, but not others. And then some people access other states, but not these. And so you have a lot of disagreement and back and forth. And lastly, just make sure you understand that consciousness can be raised dramatically. We're not talking about a 10% increase or even a 200% increase. We're talking about like a 10,000% increase, 1,000,000% increase, 1,000,000,000% increase in consciousness, such that you literally start to feel like you're inhabiting a different reality, even though in a sense nothing changes, but then everything changes. So this needs to be understood, because some people convince themselves that, oh, like I've increased my consciousness a bit, and then they start to think like, oh, okay, so yeah, I've experienced a few mystical states or a few altered states of consciousness. I've been raising my consciousness over the last couple of years. Therefore, I understand what it's like to be at the highest levels. No, you don't. Not even close. You're probably not even 1% complete. There are probably states that are so radical that you couldn't even imagine them. And so just stay humble. Stay humble, stay open, keep doing the work. Keep checking yourself. Never tell yourself that that's it, I've arrived, and that's the end of that. Because usually if you say that, you're going to be wrong. You're going to stop very short of the ultimate depth that you can go to. All right, that's it. That's what consciousness is. Please click the like button for me. Leave a comment about my beard. Leave a comment about my shirt. Let me know what you think. And come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. Come check out the blog. I post some exclusive content and videos and stuff there. There's some pretty good blog posts that you can find there. I think come check out the forum. Come check out the book list. I'm actually going to be updating the book list really soon. So stay tuned. In the next week or two, I will update the book list with about 20 new books about yoga, about consciousness, about all this sorts of stuff. So that's going to be cool. And that update is free for people who've already purchased it. And also check out the Life Purpose course. All right, that's it. The last thing I'll tell you is that there's nothing more worthwhile than becoming more conscious. And that's what Actualized.org is about. Every video that I release is trying to make you move towards higher consciousness in some fashion, because that's what all personal development ultimately boils down to. Consciousness is the master key to life. So stick with me, keep watching the episodes, keep doing the practices and working on it. And what you'll find is that your consciousness will gradually increase. There will be moments when you do maybe some psychedelics, or you go on some meditation retreat or whatever, you have some mystical experience, that your consciousness will shoot through the roof. Those will be those exciting, amazing peak experiences, which will then really convince you of the value of this work. and then you'll get much more serious about it, and then you'll start to actually understand some of this lofty, abstract, philosophical, metaphysical stuff that I talk about, and then you will really get into it, and from then on, your life will be very special. Which is not to say it won't be difficult. There will still be a lot of difficulties there. You're still going to have to pursue more consciousness, so you're not going to fix it in one shot. But like the most important thing I think for people who are new to this work is try to get your first real mystical experience. However you do it, through psychedelics, which is probably the easiest way, or through a meditation retreat, through yoga, something like that. Get it, and then just see how miraculous and amazing and mystical reality is, and then come back and we can really get to work.